Thank you, Your Holiness. And now the last question from the son of a very dear friend of yours, Baba Amte. This is Dr. Prakash Amte, who goes every morning. He works for the tribals and he goes for his morning walk with 2 leopards. Prakash Bhai.
Thank you, His Holiness. My question is...
Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, Prakash Bhai.
Okay. Thank you, His Holiness. My father Baba had studied many religions, but his work started with humanity as a religion. Historically, we have considered sexuality, procreation as human, natural, and necessary. However, the history of sexual violence is as ancient as it is brutal. We continue to see it being used as a tool to define, strengthen, and accentuate class, caste, and gender boundaries. Is such behavior native to humankind? How do we get people to stop this? Thank you very much.
Yes. Now, as I already mentioned, we also as I mentioned earlier, when we were young, you see, no feeling of distinction. Now, gradually, the different races, different country, and also sex, all these, you see, later develop. So, education, according, more emphasis about past negligence, and due to that, now today we face some unnecessary problem. So through education, we can change these things. So most important is education. And then sometimes the religion also, you see, some sort of impact about because of the differences. And for example, male and female and different race, color, like this. Then that, now, as I mentioned earlier, the secular way of thinking, then these are, you see, outdated. So education, I feel education is key thing. So as I mentioned earlier, I am very, very eager go to Delhi and some meeting with some educationists, some professors, some scientists. Like that? Okay. Admonition. Amde. Yes. Oh. As soon as I received the Nobel Peace Prize, then I immediately decided some portion of that money give as a Baba Amde. Wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Your Holiness. On behalf of the 7 or 8 of us who've had the privilege of talking to you, of the millions of people around the world, for your time and your blessings. And as I always describe myself as an unworthy student of yours, in a very un-Buddhist way, may I say a prayer, even though you've said that prayer isn't essentially a Buddhist aspiration. A short prayer on behalf of all of us to you, Your Holiness. It's a long life prayer. To the assembly of most kind teachers, both present and past, the miraculous dance of the body, speech, and mind of innumerable Buddhas, manifesting in accord with the aspirant's spiritual capacities, the wish-granting jewel, the source of all virtue and goodness, To you we offer our prayers with the fervent devotion that Tenzin Gyatso, protector of the land of snows, live for 100 eons. Shower on him your blessings, so that his aspirations are fulfilled without hindrance, and that we may all be his worthy students. Thank you, Your Holiness.
That's all. No. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
As I mentioned, I'm thinking, looking forward one sort of meeting from time to time in Delhi or Chandigarh or these places. We need. So the problem, when more problem there, then we need serious discussion. That's very important. We should not have the feeling, oh, this is our way of life, this is our way of life. Should not thinking that way. Day and night, although they are the same sun, same moon, but on detail, sun also changing, moon also changing. So we also now, same human being, but the situation changing. So we have to think according to the new change. Basically, of course, I admire, say, Western materialistic civilization. I really admire. But thinking, as I mentioned earlier, see, the hygiene of emotion totally lacking. So now we, people in this country, I think we should be more active. Okay. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Good morning, Your Holiness.
Good morning.
I would like to begin by thanking you for gracing us with your presence today. It's such an honor and privilege for us to share time with you, Your Holiness, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone joining us around the world. Your Holiness, I'm Daniel Aiken, CEO and publisher at Wisdom Publications, and today we gather online to celebrate the publication of the latest volume in the Science and Philosophy in the Indian Buddhist Classic series, known in Tibetan as Senrik Kuntu. Here at this book launch, I'm delighted to be joined by the series editor, Thupten Jimpala, the principal translator of this volume, Dr. Dechen Rochard, and the author of the contextual essays, Professor John Dunn. On behalf of Wisdom, I'd like to thank them for their amazing work in bringing this incredible book to fruition. I think, Your Holiness, you can see everyone else on the screen as well. So I'll let you know that we're also joined by the translator of the first volume, Dr. Ian Coughlin, and the translator of the forthcoming volume, Volume 3, Professor Donald Lopez. Also present are over 12 different language translators and Wisdom's editors of the volumes. So, Your Holiness, today's book launch celebrates the publication of the latest volume in the series. This is called The Mind. This volume is the second volume in an ambitious 4-volume series. And there they are there. That's the series. So this series was conceived and compiled under Your Holiness's visionary guidance as part of a project to share with the larger world the knowledge and insights of the great Nalanda tradition of Buddhism. The Tibetans have been the faithful custodians, the holder of the wisdom of the Indian masters from the Nalanda tradition. And now through His Holiness' vast activities and through this ambitious project, the wisdom of the Nalanda tradition is being offered not only back to India, but to the entire world. Your Holiness, Wisdom Publication is honored, and indeed it's a great joy to play a part in fulfilling the vision of His Holiness and to help make these texts available to the English-speaking world. So, Your Holiness, as you know, the first volume is already available around the world. So this is this volume. It's called The Physical World, and it explores the material world. So from the macroscopic to the microscopic. And then, yeah, Your Holiness, you have the second volume there. So that's the new one. And so the new volume, this is a second volume. It's called The Mind, as you know, and the Buddhist concept, it talks about the Buddhist conception of the mind and consciousness. And the book provides a vision of the inner world with fascinating implications for the contemporary disciplines of cognitive science, psychology, and the philosophy of the mind. So, Your Holiness, as you know, in the first volume, we cover the outer world. And in the second volume, we cover the inner world. And yet there are 2 more volumes to come. So, Your Holiness, I wish I could be there with you because it's such a great honor and privilege for Wisdom Publication to publish these. But still, I wanted to be able to offer you the book virtually. So, Your Holiness, I have a kata here, and I'll just get the microphone. And so, Your Holiness.
Thank you.
So, Your Holiness, I hope that arrived in Dharamsala there. So, Your Holiness, we're going to have a question and answer session very shortly about the book. I'm going to ask you about, the benefit of this book and the Nalanda tradition. But first, I wanted to invite Professor John Dunn, who wrote the illuminating contextual essays in this volume, to just say a few things about the role of those essays in the book. So, John, I'll hand it over to you.
Oh. On.
Okay.
Sound.
Oh. Yes.
John Dunn, unmute.
Gonda, Hangan Orson Gonda, sorry. So it's a real pleasure to see you again, Your Holiness. I'm coming to you from Madison, Wisconsin, where you've been several times. And and many people here send their greetings to you. The Senik Gundu, the second volume on the mind, is really an incredibly important piece of work. It's going to have, I think, a real impact on the dialogue between Buddhism and science. And part of the reason for that is that there really is a perspective that Buddhism brings, which science doesn't quite have. It's very important, I think, for scientists and philosophers, scholars, to have the alternative perspective, a kind of new perspective that Buddhism presents, especially on the mind and the way that the mind works. But in order for us to make this volume really have a max...
The Chinese Badan, Shimbatsuki, around the Sharshobe, that you took down the same Namshako, the Shangway, the kitchen image.
But in order to really make this volume very accessible for scientists and philosophers from the West, we thought we needed to write some contextual essays. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that there are certain types of very fundamental motivations, as you know, Your Holiness, for the presentation of the mind in Buddhism, which really has to do with the relief of suffering. But science doesn't always come from these same kinds of motivations. So it's important for scientists to understand the way in which this fundamental motivation informs the perspective on the mind that is coming from Buddhism. That was one reason we thought we needed these essays. Another reason is that actually Buddhism, because it has this new perspective, sometimes is difficult for scientists and others to understand. So, for example, the Buddhist presentation of the mind does not include the idea that there is a controller, an autonomous self that is the controller of the aggregates, for example, what we call in Sanskrit an Atman. And so, but in the West, there's kind of an assumption historically in science that in some sense or another, there must be a self. But of course, in a controlling autonomous self. But of course, in neuroscience, we know that this has changed, and yet this is a new view. And so it's very helpful to have essays that explain some of these from their Western perspective, which are quite new and maybe even unusual and difficult to understand perspectives. Part of what I tried to do when I wrote these essays, to the best of my ability, was also to build some bridges between the Buddhist perspective and the perspective we find in Western science and Western philosophy. So, for example, when we think about the distinction between the conceptual and the non-conceptual, when we think about the category of not the 5 omnipresent functions, or the distinction between two categories, the kundronga and the yungenga, what we call the five omnipresent semjung, the five omnipresent mental functions, and the five with a determinate object, what we call the yungenga. That distinction actually, in very interesting ways, relates to a distinction that's been emerging over the last couple of decades in Western science, cognitive science, about the distinction between what we can sense, what we can experience, but can't really describe, and then what we can describe. So we call this a distinction between the phenomenal and the access consciousness. So this is just one example of the kinds of distinctions that we've tried to build bridges with between the Buddhist material and the Western cognitive scientific and philosophical material. That helps, we think that by writing essays in this way, it will help readers who don't have much background in Buddhism to really appreciate the incredibly important information, the really in some ways quite amazing contribution that the Nalanda tradition has to the study of the mind. And finally, thinking about, we also tried to point out some maybe issues or ideas that would be especially useful for scientists and researchers to examine. In particular, we thought, for example, that the theory of meditation, as you know, here at Madison at the Center for Healthy Minds with my colleague Richie Davidson, we do a lot of work on what happens when we meditate. What are the effects of different kinds of meditation practices? But in order to do that, we need theories. And actually, the Buddhist tradition, as you know, of course, Your Holiness, has many very profound theories about how meditation practices operate. And so we also tried to point out to our readers in these essays how some of these theories might be very useful for their own research. For example, theories about the distinction between mindfulness and meta-awareness, or what we call Drenpa and Sheijin. So that kind of distinction is something that we really tried to point out as being potentially very useful for our readers, especially those who are not so familiar with Buddhism. This is the goal of these essays. I hope I've managed to do not too bad a job anyway. I did the best I could, and it was a real honor to work on this project. There are many people I could thank, but I know that Geshe Thupten Jinpa will give thanks to everyone. So I just want to thank Wisdom Publications for the opportunity to make a contribution to such an important project. And thank you, Your Holiness, for really bringing this project to life. Tujit.
So, Your Holiness, as Professor Dunn was pointing out, is the Buddhist perspective is actually an alternative or unique perspective. But also, I think this series, Your Holiness, that you've created and conceived is unique even in the history of Buddhism. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what is it, Your Holiness, that sort of made you, or what was your reason for initiating this special series, the Sanarik Kuntu?
Okay. I respect all major world religious traditions, in spite different philosophy, different concept, all carry message of love. With that message of forgiveness, tolerance, and self-discipline. All religion, you see, carry this message. So that, and then simply, I usually telling people, the religion is human creation from the Buddhist viewpoint. So all religion, you see, mentioned best quality of human life. So that's compassion, forgiveness, these things, contentment, or these things are, you see, in order to human beings' life become more peaceful. For that, these are very important. So therefore, logically, all major religions, which essentially human creation, then we human being, you see, mentioned the best quality of human being, which is something useful for life, for happy life. So I respect all major religious tradition, wonderful. And even within Buddha's own sort of disciple, there are different people. So Buddha taught accordingly different philosophy. So it is quite clear. Firstly, I want to express the religious harmony is very important. You see, it is quite, unrealistic and also very bad. My religion, their religion. And then use that reason and fight, killing. Really unfortunate. So now we must make every effort to promote religious harmony. In order to do that, it is useful to know the different religious sort of what they are thinking, their main message, and different philosophy. Then you realize, oh, these different religious traditions have something to offer human being. Now regarding Buddhism, Buddha himself mentioned the monks, scholars should not accept my teaching out of faith, but rather investigation. 결론 다감 캐남지 sekse 다르 세션도 레퍼르타라 나이까 라워 차이 규치민 사드. 지규게 드네스바 디규게 sekse 다르 세션도 레퍼르타라 나이까 라워 차이 규치민.
The Buddha himself said that all monks and learned scholars, just as a goldsmith would examine the quality of the gold by cutting, rubbing, and burning, in the same manner, examine my words, and then on that basis accept them, not out of devotion.
Then the Buddhism, particularly Nalanda tradition, see, the Pali tradition not much use reason, rather faith. Buddha stated that as a follower of Buddha, you see, we whether they mention or not, as a Buddhist follower of Buddha, we must accept what Buddha say. Then Nalanda tradition. Nalanda actually also the education center, learning center. So then Nalanda take the Buddhist tradition. Then since they are also the education center, so they utilize logical approach. Always investigate. So in principle, even Buddha's own word, through investigation, through logical approach, if there is contradiction, then we should have right to reject Buddha's own word. So now, since Buddha himself, you see, my follower should accept, should carry investigation, my teaching, not just faith. So Nalanda, since also the education center, so they already use Praman, Sama, logic. So in Buddhism, now they extensively use logical approach. They basically, you see, Buddhism, now, Sanje Namji Che Temba, Temba Nili Yanda Den, Jigden Kuzo Temba Dan, Tambetan Temba Hoseni, Sanje Che Temba di, Temba Nil Den Yaris. Di Chik Dage, Temba Ni Sadi, Sanje Serb Kemari, Jumde Le Tawa Kemari, Kongo Nezishri, the Nungsu the Nesu Sajigi, or the Tensang quantum physics 하는 얘는 능수도 내준이 시행구요래. 사들이 인도산에 다 간다 시기 내수 터두대 시행도산에 단단대 봤었지. 능수디 간에 탄에 구조대 봤었지. 그래서 대번이 남샤디 아다 싸워샤행구도가 다디 간다 신업의 내수 다디 아니 실샤니 아니 가서 신업의 내수 람드베 rimba 저분도 치수스 그래서 내한테 변주중이가 다 대바지 지셔도 나라라야 시 내주 대니 전시신 대시 코원 죽도 지시시 세매 장부에 깁숨 대바된 탈람 자원소 진지로서네 내지 지요 시 담반이 있어 담반이 실샤베 탈이야 다 나란조 아니 동해미도부터 대원대 사인들산에 다 디두서야 되기 아니 독진 사야지 소용구도가 다 독진 사야지 동해미도부터 대원대 인들산에 다디 면은 기는 누구 말이스 다디 동해기 교다 대외 교디 세체네 그러다 아니 동해기 교디 용르다 걸리걸리 동해기 배탈 삼면서 대외 교디 준비야 야제 공부단에 줘야지. 사들이 인도산에 시대니 타네 담바 시리시한 것도 동해 담바 근주 담바 고베 담바 람제 담바 써야지. 다 동해 담바 사대 동해디 동해교 동해 주 동해 두지기 동해 쓰네. 동해 숨 여대봐 다 동해 차라 숨 여대봐 지기 다 가당 가란즈 동해지 동해 다 소 동해들이 디프 든주주 신그리 주 동해 써야돼 가란즈 다 든주도 다시면 가란즈 미소 대화리야 지대야 지기 간다 더도 동해지야 지기 제용을 주 동해 쓰도가 다 대탐지기 시설없고 누지기 등에 써야 돼 가라. 다 누지기 등에 써야 돼. 아니 파세지 저거래다. 등에 누셔 봐서 다 줄이야. 된다고 인도산에 아니 근주다 봐서 고 등에다 봐. 근주다 봤어. 다때네 아니 등에기 주 레다 녀몽 보니 다 되게 소르디 녀몽고 왕게 아니 샹라 너바다 된저기 간다 가수를 보게 미기웨 레디디 간다 다 녀몽고 왕게 랑라 차 샹라 땅 된저기 차당 그 왕게 아니 레사 용거 여러와 자 된저 인도 고물루기 레다 녀몽 세베 타르 레다 녀몽 남돌레 대다 줄레 저번이 동번이 인가고 줄으시네. 다 고물루루가 하는 송샤다 데리. 제가 데리 당연히 돼야 인지 되고 싶는 거 인지 되는 거 맞다. 다 줄으시. 다 로자업에 안 당고 돼요래. So the third noble truth, the nirvana, cessation. Now it is important. Is it possible to eliminate all these negative emotion? So now, third noble truth, you see, deal with that. Once we develop the clear sort of awareness or understanding or possibility, the causes of suffering can remove. Then we develop the enthusiasm to practice. That's the fourth noble truth. So now, these very clearly mentioned the elimination of our negative emotion will not come through prayer, through faith, but training our mind. So since the training, the fourth noble truth, the marg. So for that, now we have to know about mind. Then the negative emotion, which causing suffering, and the positive, wisdom or understanding can purify our mind. So for that reason, firstly, we have to know very thoroughly about the very nature of mind. The one, one text mentioned, the main nature of mind is clear light. There are several levels of mind or emotion. The grosser level, these destructive emotion on the level of grosser level of mind. Then these are, you see, due to certain factor develop. So all these negative emotion on that level. Then more subtle level, including when we deep sleep or meditation, another level. Then the deepest, at the time of death, all Roshinja Jukundo or Nangji Topsum Kutane Yondeagi or the Nangji Topsum Pangani, Vesechigo Shine Dizane, Yomungu Yoya Yomari.
So at the point of death, which is really a culmination of a prolonged dissolution process, during which all the levels of conceptualization and thought processes, which are indicative of many of our grosser levels of our experience, come to dissolve through stages, and eventually culminating in a complete dissolution, which is referred to as the pure luminosity or clear light. And at that state, the mind is really pure and clear, and it's totally free of any manifest levels of afflictions.
So one way, it is very important to investigate about the very nature of mind and different level of mind. The innermost subtle mind, the verses, the human history verses, ngazuta chiwe negola chiwe vesong de jibe negola verse dingon de sayung yore. Tati ume shungne tsaji sha diri.